Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe. Welcome back to City Talk. Really pleased to be having a chance to have a conversation about a really pressing topic that we are seeing across the country once again. Not that it goes away, but that it just, as the nice weather comes or the warmer weather comes, then it starts to become much more visible. And so it's an important conversation for us to have about the housing continuum and also the human rights components of this, and what are we seeing manifest before our very eyes around what do encampments tell us about what's going on around housing and shelter and people's choices and all those things, and policymakers' choices. So I'll ask my fellow city talkers to put the cameras on so you can see it's not just me you have to listen to, and just to remind people that to sign in from wherever you're signing in from. We're always appreciative to know, and also which ancestral lands you're on. I'm calling in from Toronto, which is the ancestral lands of a number of First Nations and Inuit Métis, still home to those communities, but historically to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. I think I maybe missed one. Haudenosaunee, thank you. And you know, we are continuing in our struggle to understand about how do we honor those? How do we actually do the truth and the reconciliation part? It's not easy at all, and it's not simple. And we are also concerned about land acknowledgements becoming kind of rote, as you can hear. We just sort of trot it out, and we have to actually come to terms with what the real manifestations of that, of a reconciled state would look like. And what does that look like? And I think encampments are an interesting conversation to ground us in that, because these are always ancestral lands that people are choosing to pitch a tent on or sleep rough or whatever it is that's going on. And maybe that's part of how we can inform our conversation this morning or this afternoon, depending on your time zone, because it really does, put right in front of us a visceral example of whose land is this? What are we doing with it? What is the access? What are the safety issues? What are all the different ways in which we congregately gather to live or sleep or seek solace or wherever it is. So I'm very appreciative to have these folks with us. 3 of them have been on before, and so they're familiar to City Talkers. But welcome, Betty. I don't think you've been on a City Talk before, so thanks for joining. Nobody talked you out of it, so that's good. And we always say these are candid conversations. We're only on for the hour, and we try to cut right to the chase, as they say. And we're not that worried about being polite with one another about these things. We're trying to be as direct and as blunt as we can. The other thing is we've always started with the frame of what's working, what's not, and what's next. So we always try to ground these in practical conversations. And I think when it comes to encampments, there's a lot of, as we would say, blah, blah, blah. And the question is, can we move from the blah, blah, blah to tangible kinds of ways of approaching this? So as we tend to, as is our pattern at City Talk, I'm going to ask each of you for a couple of opening comments. And in this case, I think I'm going to go from east to west. And as it turns out, we have 2 people from Ottawa and 2 people from Vancouver on this call. But I know that a number of you are looking at other cities across the country, and it's not unique to either of yours. So we'll be interested to hear the very specific experiences you're having, and then let's talk a bit about what's going on. And I count on the City Talk audience across the country to fill in the blanks for us in terms of what you're seeing, what's working, what's not, and what's next in the city in which you live and work. So Leilani, I'm going to go to you first, because you have a global practice on these issues. And why don't we start with you, 30,000 feet. And then we'll go to Catherine, and then we'll swing over to the west and hear about what's going on literally on the front lines in Vancouver. So to you first, Leilani, welcome back to City Talk.
Thanks, Mary. I'm not sure I'm going to only do 30,000 feet, because
that's fine.
I've been working with cities across Canada on this very issue. So, but I do want to start at 30,000. So thank you for that, which is I want to start from the place of people living in homelessness and in encampments as a violation of human rights. And it's essential that we understand that when people have been denied dignity, their health is in jeopardy, their life is often in jeopardy, their ability to secure or maintain employment is in jeopardy. Those are all the makings of a human rights violation. And when you have a human rights issue at hand, it seems only reasonable that the response would be a human rights response. And what I love about that as the way forward, and I'm starting to see this percolating across the country, is it's transformational human rights approach. Suddenly, the person who's rolling out their sleeping bag in a park is a rights holder, someone whose rights have been violated and someone whose rights need to be made whole. And it transforms for governments. So that changes the relationship between government and people and living in encampments. But it also says to governments, oh, human rights issue. This means this is a priority. And from there, it helps them establish how much resources needs to be put in this direction, how much attention needs to be paid. So I will say, just in terms of what's not working, approaches that don't treat people living in encampments as rights holders, approaches that do treat them like criminals, worthy only of surveillance and that sort of thing. I don't know if you want me to go on. You know me, I can go on at length.
Yeah, well, so I guess what I want to get from you is, if we were taking a human rights approach, how would we be handling this differently?
Totally differently. So, and I think others can speak to this because they're engaged in this more human rights oriented approach. But the first thing is to recognize that people living in homeless encampments are actually experts in their own lives. If you engage in those populations, you'll know they have ideas for how their reality could be better in the immediate as well as in the longer term. All of them, really everyone wants adequate, secure, and affordable housing at the end of the day. But they want to be part of that solution and part of making that happen. And of course, some need supports, some want their own community supports. They don't want government supports, et cetera. But if you just begin by recognizing and engaging with recognizing the expertise of that population and engaging them in a meaningful way. I'm not talking, let's check boxes, visited the site once, met a homeless person. No, I'm talking about meaningful engagement. The results will be definitely different. That's for sure.
Yeah, I guess Catherine, I'm going to come to you next, but Leilani, let's continue on with the group. But I think the question that I'm trying to pose is, if a city were in fact, what I'm interested in, you and I've had these conversations over the last couple of years, the extent to which the human rights frame could compel a different level of enforcement or implementation or investment or something. Why don't I let Catherine, who's a city councillor, respond to that as somebody who I know is advocating for a human rights approach. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks, Mary. I'm kind of joining you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe here. And, Ottawa has not had a number of encampments, if you will. That doesn't mean that we don't have people who are unsheltered and whose human rights are not being met in housing. In 2019, just before we declared a housing emergency in the city, which happened in early 2020, we had approximately 70 people who were sleeping outside regularly. And that went up to 225 in the fall of 2020, so at the height of COVID. But it was doubling every year, regardless of COVID. I just want to put that out there. It wasn't just COVID, but COVID obviously accelerated that number. We've not seen the encampments that other cities have, and I believe it's this. This multi-jurisdictional quagmire that we find ourselves in. We have our largest green spaces, our largest parks are owned and operated by the National Capital Commission. Mm-hmm. They're not public, they're not city parks. So I believe that kind of enforcement in terms of moving people along, there's unwritten rules about who can sleep where. I've spoken to many people who sleep outside. There are unwritten rules in the city about where you can sleep, which parks, which underpass, what time you have to be up, what time you have to, hold up your sleeping bag.
But the irony of it is that you can sleep if you're in a truck. Right?
Well, we saw that. Irony. No, thousands, absolutely.
This is the irony. So, and Paul McKinnon's put a point into the chat, and we'll get everybody in to respond to that, where he's talking about Mitch Silver's approach in New York, which is a zero tolerance of sleeping in parks. But I want to just go back to, it is an interesting question, Catherine, to think about this, about why didn't we, forgetting about the truckers and the convoy, that was just a bit of a red herring, but why haven't we seen encampments? Whereas in Donnie and Betty's city, we're going to hear that they really became the sort of encampment central for the country. So it's a curious thing. Anyway, so you haven't seen it, and the question is it about the jurisdiction of the lands? I don't know. It's
I
interesting.
believe it is. I believe that what is happening is that encampments are not, people are not allowed to bundle up, if you will. I think in some ways it's worse, right? Because you're left to be scattered.
Yeah.
But I do believe that, and I believe it's partly the fact that NCC, MTO, which is Ministry of Transportation, off-ramps were a place where people put up tents. They're taken down quickly. So it's
and that would be a policy that was established by the province to take those tents down, because you're saying it's MTO, so it's provincial, where they just took them down quickly, a bit like the broken windows thing. You just clean it up immediately and it won't recur.
Absolutely. So it's not to say that we don't have people sleeping outside in the same numbers. We just don't allow them to, we don't seem to have allowed them to go into encampments. Now some things have been done right at the city. I want to give some credit. We have an unsheltered task force that, that does go in and try, works with people to ensure that they have, a housing worker and that they're, within the system. But again, when you have that number of people who are unsheltered and you're not seeing the encampments, my concern is always, what are those unwritten rules and how are they having a negative impact on people? Because if you don't have the encampments, you have nowhere to go in to ensure that who these people are. Again, something else that the city did that was positive through COVID was we opened up respite centers, and those respite centers have been a lifeline for people sleeping outside and at shelter. And what that has done, and it's very unique, and it's something that we're trying to push to keep going post-COVID, is that rather than go out and do, a point in time counts where you get that kind of snapshot once a year, once every couple of years, people who are working in those respite centers know who is unsheltered, their unique needs, who they are, and able to address those unique needs. So some things positive happening, but my concern has always been, where is everyone?
Are we not finding them? Yeah. So the enforcement issue question, and I wish we had a better word for enforcement, but anyway, that, and then the by name approach, the idea that staff actually know by name, and they say, Betty, where are you sleeping tonight? Okay.
Absolutely. All right, let's go. How did you get here? How did you get here? And if it's that simple, how can we get you out? And they've been able to do that, right? So these respite centers where people can come in, shower, wash their clothing, connect to services, and just get friendly faces and people who care about them has been a lifesaver, really.
It's interesting how the provision of other supports may in fact be a way to do this, to head this off. Okay, Donnie and Betty, I don't know how the two of you wanted to divvy this up. Why don't I just go to either of you and either of you start? I guess I could start with Donnie, only in that Donnie walked me through a couple of months ago the parks. I saw them last fall and I saw them again in the spring, or whatever, I guess it was your spring. It was still winter everywhere else, but it was spring for you. For us to see what the sort of transformation was from a couple of sites that had been extraordinarily large encampments. So Donnie, why don't we start with you, and then you can segue to Betty at your convenience, okay?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Mary. And I'm joining you from what's now called Vancouver, the unceded ancestral territory, the stolen land from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And Vancouver is sunny today. So it's a glorious day here in Vancouver.
God, I'm surprised you're not out celebrating, the two of you.
I know, about to be. And really, truly, our moderate temperatures are one of the reasons why we have such a large community of people living hard and living in encampments. Vancouver has approximately 2,000 people who are unhoused. And I think that was the last count that was done by the Homelessness Services. So I'm the general manager of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation. So I'm Parks and Rec. I am not a housing or an homelessness or unhoused person's expert in any way, shape, or form. And when I joined the park board, the first order of operations for me was to get to Strathcona Park and the encampment that was there. At its peak, there were 500 tents. It was truly a subculture, a community. It was massive. Anywhere at any given time, anywhere between 2 and probably 350 people who felt that that was their home in that space. And interestingly, there were people who went to their shelters or homes in the evening and came back during the day for the community. The stuff that went on there during the day and the community that was built was undeniable, and it was palpable. You could feel it. And when I would be there and I would see the interactions and see the respect and the unwritten, if you will, code that happened there, it was just it was phenomenal to see that. And what the community and what we often as Parks and Rec practitioners focus on is, well, there's a criminal element. We have to, that's it. We associate homelessness and unhoused people with criminal element. Well, it's a fact. There is often a criminal element, but that shouldn't define what's going on out there. And we can't let it define. We can't focus on just that. Otherwise, we lose focus of the important things. And as Leilani said, of the human rights and the rights holders. So as I said, 500 tents at peak. This encampment was there just shy of a year. And what we did was we took a collaborative approach. I'll tell you about who the partners were, but the partners took this approach that we were going to try to bring a harm reduction lens. We were going to try to center reconciliation. And 100% we didn't get it right. 100% we made mistakes. I learned, and we all learned every single day, but we always came back to that and tried to ground that in our decision making. And we held each other to that along the way and learned a lot together. So eventually 280 folks were moved indoors, some into housing, some into shelters, some SROs. And this was a collaboration between the park board. So we have a separate independent elected board who runs the park system here. The city who have outreach services, BC Housing, who definitely played a role and brought the province's lens to this. The not-for-profit providers in the community who were working in the encampment, whether it was service providers, there was a overdose prevention site with volunteers, like all kinds of things going on site. So the not-for-profit service providers had a huge relationship there. Then the unhoused community leadership. There was a definitive leader, and there was someone that we connected with, and there were community meetings that we attended to meet with and talk with the leaders of the encampment. And they played an integral role in helping us understand who was there, what they needed, and how they could be moved indoors, housed, in a way that was going to be most successful, and or at least had the best chances for success, because we know that it doesn't always work. The local community also played a role, and it was an interesting role because there were a lot of vocal folks in the local community who did not want us moving anybody out until there was appropriate housing. And then there was the local community who said, I want my park back, get them out. It was a real mix mash, and we really had to work with the community to find that middle ground, if you will, and find a way to share the park with everybody who needed it at that time. Of course, there was also, I mentioned a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the city, the park board, and the province, and it really said, we're responsible for this, we're responsible for this, and we're going to keep going until we meet that obligation. And that's a piece of work that continues to be ongoing. I think that, and I'll pass it over to Betty on this. I will say that the encampment moved over to Crab Park and started up again, and not the same numbers, but we still have, it's not going away. We still have people who are unhoused. They still need a place to shelter overnight. We have a parks control bylaw that allows that. And so at Crab Park, we did seek an injunction, and it was clear to us that the courts didn't want to they didn't want to solve this. They didn't want to get involved and say, go this way or that way. They want us to take a human rights approach, and they want us to center the people at the camp and their safety. So I took this away and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to run this park board. I have a big, responsibilities across the board. I can't give this enough attention, nor am I equipped. This, again, I said this in the beginning, I have no expert in this. So I set out to develop a position, and this was the Director of Urban Relationships. And it's important that we understand that this is about relationships. And so I met Betty. And Betty can tell you how she joined us and her work that she's doing. But essentially, what we realized was we needed to listen to, obviously, the people who are at the camp. We needed to hear what the courts were saying, and we needed to come back with an approach that really centered the human being. And so that's where we're at in Vancouver. And I'm just beyond excited to be working with Betty Lebs.
Thanks, Donnie. Wow, this is amazing. Yes, it's my first time being involved with the conversation, and it's energizing, and I'm listening to everyone and being able to, take it in and also be able to share with you what I'm doing. I want to share that I am fortunate to work, play, and live in the unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm a guest on their land. So Donnie explained it so very well. I was co-lead of Strathcona Park. And at the time that I came on with BC Housing, there was about 300 people sheltering in the park. And as Donnie said, we took a collaborative approach. And that's not only with the systems that we're working with, but also with the people sheltering in the park. And Leilani said this perfectly. It can't be a one-time off thing where you're saying to people, hey, what do you want? They have to contribute, they have to be a part of. When we talk about human rights or humanitarian responsibility and being a racialized person, we need to be involved. We need to learn from each other. We need to understand each other's stories. If we don't understand the stories, we have the NIMBYism. We have the stigma that comes along with things until we hear and understand each other's stories. Otherwise, we have our own stories in our heads. And some was said today that there's criminal behavior, that there's, addictions, and people have mental health, and this is my community, and safety becomes an issue. So when you look at the whole complement of people sheltering outside and encampments forming, it's really about we're missing something. We're missing something in parts of the system. And to be able to bring that all together, we have to understand each of the systems. We're also living in huge colonialistic ways that have not changed forever. And so what is our role in that? When we talk about humanitarian responsibilities, I believe we all and each of us have a role. And part of that role is to listen and understand. So I met Donnie at Strathcona Park, and I was fairly new to BC Housing. I was co-leading the bringing people inside. And we did host a meeting every week with the leader of the park, but also invited all the campers. We had all of the city parking because we also had campers and so on parked outside. So we had parking, we had outreach teams, we had Indigenous outreach, we had cultural outreach to reach out to other racialized communities. We had Vancouver Coastal Health. So we brought together everyone. When we're talking about a humanitarian approach, it's important to know that when parks and recreations are out there, it's out there for everyone to enjoy. It's out there for everyone's well-being, physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual. And so we have to bring all those pieces together. And we know those that have been street entrenched for a long time, they're going through emotional distress and trauma. They're going through physical ailments. So having coastal health there to be able to support, having Indigenous health there to be able to do this from a culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive way is critical. But do these things take time? They take years. I've been involved in community development for over 35 years. And the systems take a long time. We change and systems change, meaning people who start something, then they leave on to something else, and we're starting at the beginning again. So one of the things is to capture and understand what an encampment is. Who is in the encampment? What is it like? So we can start documenting and putting together process to be able to best support those that are sheltering, but also from an understanding of, and I think Catherine mentioned this, that what happens when we get over 14, 15 people together? What happens if they're spread out? How do we make and produce policy and bylaws to support people's well-being and human rights? And so it's looking into all those pieces, even with Crab Park, and all the parks actually that we've had encampments. There's another system, which is the advocates and what they're advocating for. So how do we relate with them? Absolutely, we don't always share the same views, or we don't always do it the same way, but how do we work together for a common denominator, which is ensuring people's best well-being? And we may all do that differently. So we have to understand all those pieces to be able to support people in a humanistic way. And so from there, in meeting Donnie at Strathcona Park, we had a lot of interactions because I was with BC Housing. And then Donnie started to say, you know, after the Supreme Court hearing, looking at things differently and how can we work with those sheltering in the park? What is our goal as Parks and Recreation with working with those sheltering in the park? And it's to provide all users with the best well-being. So how do we do that? Because those sheltering in the park are a user of the park as well. And so we started to have conversations about what this may look like. And it blossomed into further conversation and interest. And Johnny was innovative and created this, this role as Director of Urban Relationships. And we're working it through together. And we're building on that and seeing what this looks like. Who do we need?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And I mean, this is one of the great things I think about CityTalk and about what we're trying to do at the Urban Institute generally is be the connective tissue, because what I know is now everybody working in another city is saying, we want our own Donnie and Betty team too. I mean, the difference it makes when you have people who are focused, zeroed in on this, right? And as you've been, and it's so important for the rest of us to hear your experience. You know, I'm recalled of an adage that I always sort of appropriate in my own words, which is Jane Jacobs always talked about the kind of problem a city is. She was trying to make the point that things that manifest as problems are actually just things that need to be worked on, you know? And as opposed to, you know, saying, oh my God, the city's in trouble. Look at all these problems, that we actually just wait and say, well, actually cities are in the business of solving things. And so let's solve it. So one of the things I've wondered about, and I appreciate Betty, it's you spoke to it in a way, is why are encampments appealing to people? Like, why are they manifesting? What can we learn from encampments? And we've had people on these calls over the last 2 years with lived experience who have slept rough, and a number of things they talk about, just what you were suggesting, they have a sense of community. They self-organize, they appoint leaders, they have a different experience living in, they feel like, some of them feel, I mean, not all, but some feel they have more agency there than if they're parked in some shelter or something. And so, well, then how do we learn from that and build on that as an organic manifestation of an impulse that people have? So I'm curious, I might go back to you, Catherine, because the dilemma you've got is that they're in smaller groups. They're not actually encamping in that way. But do you see, could you imagine in your municipality putting in place the kinds of infrastructure that Betty and Donnie represent, so that people would feel they had an opportunity to have somebody who knew them by name and who was going to participate with them directly to find the right situation for them? Is that what encampments can teach us, that that's the level of care people need?
Oh, absolutely. If I think about what I like about my neighborhood, I love the neighborhood I live in, and it's because there is a sense of community. I know my neighbors. We look after each other. We don't all agree, and we don't all like each other necessarily,
Right.
but we're all in it together, right? And that is what community does. And so, you know, when you think, I go back to the respite centers that the city of Ottawa created, and it did give people who are unhoused, or whether unsheltered and unhoused, that
There was a
same
place.
sense, right? And there was absolutely.
Well,
I
they
used
had
to get videos from staff, and it's very interesting because the staff that were put in place, and I was thinking about this while Donnie was talking. Actually, the staff that were put in place at the very beginning, it was in the ward that I represent at this arena, were recreation staff, and they had never worked with unhoused people. They never worked in community social services. They ran
Did it
our
work?
rinks.
Did it
It
work?
worked. It changed their lives. Can I tell
Well,
you?
I'm sure it
They will
changed
tell
their lives.
you it
I'm sure it
changed their
changed their
lives.
lives. Everybody open your mics, unless you've got a child crying in the background, because it's just much easier to have free forming back and forth. And if a dog barks, then we can mute.
But what the respite center did was it did just that, right? People came together. I used to get like videos on Friday night of them all doing YMCA together, right? Like
Right.
it was it. So you knew they were leaving there at Friday at 5 when it shut down, but you knew they were leaving there, and they knew they could come back Saturday morning or Monday morning, and that somebody cared about where they were over the weekend.
So,
And that's something that doesn't exist for unhoused people.
well, we've got to think about this though, Leilani, because we've had it on these programs in the past where I don't know if anybody remembers, we had a woman who was in an encampment in Toronto, and then she was placed into a supportive housing situation. She was in a wheelchair, and she was put into the 12th or 14th floor. She went to the desk and said, look, I'm in a wheelchair. If there's a fire issue, you've got to come get me. And sure enough, something happened, and they didn't get her. And she felt much safer in the encampment. So Leilani, what do you make of that in terms of, are we not providing the range of housing choice that we could be?
Correct. One of the things that surprises me, because I have sort of an international perspective, I'm sometimes able to step outside of being Canadian and being in Canada. And it surprises me that there isn't more of a movement to take a good long look at shelters, and maybe moves like what Finland has done, which is really to close down a lot of shelters over time, moving to that housing first approach. So in fact, turning some shelters into long-term affordable housing.
And did they have to be brave and say, it's a bit like a sunset clause, like those shelters are going to close, therefore the system must? Is that what?
That's correct. That's correct. And they had a whole plan for how they were going to roll out the closing of the shelters, how many they were going to need, over time, et cetera. And so, and then, the big push on ensuring acquisitions and renovations, et cetera.
And all that had to fall into place.
Exactly. And I mean, Betty had said this takes a long time. And one of the things that worries me about Canada is this has been a problem that with roots in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, right?
Yep.
And add to that the horrible housing market that Canada is now in.
Yeah.
One of the worst in the world right now, believe it or not, in terms of housing costs, right? Our housing costs have doubled since 2020.
Yeah.
Right.
Crazy.
And so what worries me is how entrenched this is here, how bad governments have allowed the situation to get, how many chronically homeless folks there are. And so this idea that Betty said, you know, this is going to take a long time, I think there's some truth to that. The only thing is I look to my international experience and I say, okay, if you look at a city like Porto, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, it's in Portugal. It's, if you get a chance, go, it is gorgeous, amazing, one of the most beautiful UNESCO protected areas, blah, blah, blah. They had a historic center that was horrible, full of drugs, prostitution, crime, gangs, homelessness, etc. And very quickly they were able to turn it around. And it had been like that for many, many, many years. But they were able to turn it around because of multi-level government commitment to turning it around. And right now in this country, I have to say, I find it shocking that the federal government can say in September of 2019, a new commitment, September 2020, new commitment, we're going to end chronic homelessness. And to have not had a detailed conversation with every major city and minor city in the country to ensure that that commitment can come good. I mean, let's hear from the cities, but I talk to cities all the time and they're telling me, no, that commitment was not made in conjunction with us. And no, we cannot do that.
Right. Well, and you know, tune in, nice segue there, Leila. Tune in next week when we're going to do a City Talk on Wednesday about the National Housing Council's reach out to many of you to talk about how the National Housing Strategy needs to be adjusted. And we experience this every day at CY, the disconnect between federal policy and how actual local policy is that local programs are implemented. I just want to put a little shout out for the chat. As is always the case with City Talk, there is a whole life over there in the chat. And those of you that are frequent City Talk registrants and have sat on a City Talk, and maybe we've done over 150 of them, maybe you've been on 10 or 150, and you don't sign into the chat, it's your loss. Just saying, because there's a lot of smart things that are being said in that chat, that it's a parallel universe, and we post it afterwards. But please, if you've never signed in to actually participate in the chat and you're listening right this minute, put your tuna fish sandwich down and sign into the chat, and you're going to read a lot of interesting things. You know, just back to what the practicalities of this would be. If, you know, Donnie, it's interesting to me that in the park world, your world did adopt a kind of stewardship approach a number of years ago. I first was exposed to it, and park stewards. And I remember thinking at the time, you know, I like that notion of stewards, like we're stewards of neighborhoods, we're stewards of main streets, we're stewards of libraries, park stewards. And in many ways, throughout the park movement came a broader kind of ecological understanding of how you steward your asset. And adding Betty and Betty's approach and the visceral experience you guys have had with encampments, you've woven people into that. So you're stewards of community and people. And I'm interested, when I watched the process unfold in Strathcona, Crab, and Oppenheimer, I was interested about that the politicians and the bureaucrats gave you time. How come? How did you navigate the time? We've had other cities where they ran out of time and the cops came in, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How come you were able to get the time?
That's a great question, Mary. Thank you. So in Vancouver, we have an independently elected park board.
And I think you might be the only city that still does. Somebody in the chat, smart chat, if you've got a park board, put it in. But I think Vancouver might be the only one still with one. Go ahead.
I'm told not to say the only one, but one of the only ones.
One of the only
so that
but you have a separate governance structure and
we do
accountability structure for the parks, like a school board, for instance. And
similar, but similar but different. But so this board gave me the direction that we will not move people out of the encampment until there is adequate housing, and the way we defined adequate was that there were enough indoor spaces available for the people outdoors. And once those numbers matched up, or at least that's what we thought defined adequate. What we learned from the judge now through this latest injunction is that adequate is yet to be defined, and adequate is actually something a lot more than, X number of indoor spaces and X number of people matching up. And that's the work that Betty's working on.
But let me go further on this. Why was the park board, why did they feel that they could give you that runway?
Yeah.
I mean, is there a public did they know that the public would support a more managed process, and other cities, maybe councils are nervous that their public won't? I don't know. I don't know what happened, but
I don't know that the public was necessarily fully supportive, for sure. It was a real balance of that, and there was a lot of argument and a lot of pushback on the elected body. But what they understood was that as long as it was just going to go from one park to another park to another park,
move. So
and so this is that the housing conversation just fascinates me, because I'm like, go housing people, solve it. In the meantime, we have encampments that we have to manage.
Yeah. And the point is that I don't think that any one sector can solve it. I guess that's the point. So Betty, we're getting questions in the chat about work for BC Housing. So you have worked in a provincial agency, and we're getting questions in the chat. One of the proverbial Canadian questions, which is, whose jurisdiction is this to solve this? And are the provinces sufficiently involved? So maybe you could comment a bit about where the province of BC, why the approach it has taken and what you're observing. And then I'd love to hear from the others, Leilani and Catherine, about what they think provincial jurisdiction should be. Go ahead, Betty.
I think that's the question of the year. And Leilani mentioned
Where are the provinces?
Exactly. And to make those changes, this is complex, and not one jurisdiction can do it. It happens to be people are sheltering in the park, so that's park jurisdiction right now, but it's multiple jurisdictions. It's looking at trauma, it's looking at our cost of living, it's looking at what people get on a monthly basis for rent, it's looking at appropriate housing, as Donnie noted. It's all of those things. And so the province, and when I was there, they're trying, but the piece that's missing is knowing, what do we need to have people be successful in being housed? And we need to be clear on that. And what do they find when they're out in the community? They have community. Some of the things I've heard, when I go into housing, I close the door, I don't see anybody. They miss that. So why are we putting doors? Or, they love gathering around the fire. So we need to be more innovative and think differently to be able to have people be successful in housing. The trauma alone, if you've been living outside for a long time, we have to put appropriate supports around that to be able to have people be successful. When we talk about being successful, each of us will have a different definition of what that is, but none of us can do without support to be successful.
And Betty, I'm interested where you think the expertise is, because in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, housing is at the provincial level, and ostensibly it is in Ontario as well. But municipal governments end up being the front lines of this. And I'm just wondering, should we just throw our hands up and say, you know what, municipal staff and municipal agencies are actually the ones on the ground. Let's let them do it, and let's change the resourcing formulas so that they actually have the resources, rather than trying to constantly reach back and say, come on, province. What do you think? Are you allowed to say that? You no longer work for the province.
Yeah, that's right. But then movement will stop. That's what I fear.
You mean then the collaboration really would collapse?
Exactly.
Okay.
The municipality may get so far, they create great policy, they have human rights embedded in there, and then the province takes over and they don't know what we've done, and then it falls apart. And that's
forget it. It's a dumb idea. Forget I mentioned
the length of time. That's where it takes the length of time.
Yeah, no, I know. A collaboration is not fast. I know it takes a long time. Go ahead, Donnie.
Mary, on that, first we need to do everything that we've been asked to do. And the courts.
Who's the we there?
The park board, the municipality.
Okay.
So we were given kind of a list of things that this is the approach you need to take. So we need to turn our minds to that, do those things. And then if the only outstanding question at the end of that is, the suitability or the appropriateness of the housing, well, that's not on Parks and Rec. That
Right.
then becomes
No,
a conversation in the right place.
yeah. So this is it is a jigsaw puzzle, to use an ancient image, because anybody young don't do jigsaw puzzles, but people of a certain age still do. And it is a puzzle. And I'm interested. I see Janine from Victoria is chiming in on the chat. Janine, thanks for doing this. Victoria's had its own sets of experiences too, and I wonder whether one of the ways to deal with some of the mystique and stigma would be for us at CUI to gather from all of you the really best practice examples that we've seen in the last couple of years, where we've been able to address an encampment in a humane way that reflects human rights, that is actually effective. And could we start amplifying those success stories? I don't know how we then take it to
That'll
the next
take
step,
about
which,
10 minutes. I
well,
mean,
because there haven't
I'm
been that many, but
sorry, there have
really?
been very, very few very positive examples. You're hearing right now from one of the most positive examples
you
in
think,
the country.
but Leilani, you
I
don't
mean,
think that actually there are communities quietly dealing with this in imaginative ways and we just don't know?
Not really, not
Okay.
that we're hearing anyway. I mean,
Okay.
the shift is we're working across the country and so,
Okay.
and because I wrote that protocol, co-authored the protocol,
Yeah.
I get a lot of stuff. And I mean, the criminalization just continues,
Just
the
continues.
move along.
Yeah.
And the idea of like a compassionate approach, that's nice, but whatever, like this is a human rights issue.
But can it be both? I mean, I think we should make sure we post the protocol. I don't know whether we have.
I
in the
put it, but maybe it was very high up.
Maybe,
like I put it right at the beginning.
Maria, can you repost it further down in the chat so people can see it? And we'll start to build that case as you're suggesting, Leilani. But I guess the question for us would be, what's the most effective way to get this addressed in a humane and constructive way? And is it top?
I think intergovernmental is absolutely necessary.
Okay.
And I really liked what Donnie said, because it's true. Like, come on, municipalities, you got to come up and do everything that you can. That's your human rights obligation. This is an urgent and priority matter. Homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. That's like the worst. That means it's really bad, right? Because it engages the right to life. And so you gotta do, municipalities, everything you can do immediately, and don't hide behind jurisdictional issues. That's what Donnie's saying. But once you're down that path, you're going down the path of doing everything you can, then you've engaged other levels of government for sure. Because you're like, look, we're doing everything we can.
Right.
And we still have this problem because no one is preventing homelessness. What level of government has taken a policy decision that's actually going to prevent what the cities are dealing with, right?
But as Donnie said, Leilani, it has to be both, because she's saying go housing, but in the meantime, don't forget, I gotta park. So
exactly.
So it's got to be all hands on deck, multiple.
That's right. But look, the feds are giving money to different levels of government to address homelessness. That money should 100% have conditions attached to it. They can be human rights conditions. They can be, we used to have the Reaching Home dollars. So that's money that flows to cities for homelessness. Those Reaching Home dollars, believe it or not, under Stephen Harper, believe it or not, were tied to the housing first approach. Right. Now, there were problems with it, and it wasn't enough money. And I am not defending Stephen Harper. And
it's all right. It's all right. People can defend whoever they want.
But
Catherine was
what happened to that, right? What happened to that?
Let's hear from
the Liberals rolled it back because it was a Stephen Harper thing.
Let's hear from Catherine. She was working on the ground at that point. Go ahead, Catherine.
I certainly was. And we don't have that priority anymore. We don't have that housing first priority. We can take federal funds now and not have housing first as our policy. And I want to just touch on something else that was raised earlier, like in terms of housing loss prevention. For every one unit that we're building with public funds, we're losing 7 in the private market. And that's because of REITs. It's because of these investment trust funds that come in, they purchase buildings, and they rent-evict, they dem-evict, and put people, once you've lost, in the city of Ottawa, and I'm sure this is the case in many large cities, once you've lost an apartment that is affordable, market affordable, and has been kept that way through some rent control, once you lose it, there's not another one. You are sentenced to homelessness. So we have that. We don't have the ability to stop rent evictions as a municipality. But we also, I want to just raise this as a City of Ottawa, we have got over 200 families at all times, over 300 children for the last 3, 4 years living in motels,
Right.
a microwave, washing their dishes in the bathtub. That to me is an encampment.
Right.
It is.
And
We lost a 6-month
expensive.
old baby a few weeks ago
Right.
that died as a result of, there's just not the support that's required. So I want to go back to, what we have to have I think we need the responsibility to end homelessness at the city, at municipal.
So what do you mean? In other words, I would know. I mean, one of our frustrations in Canada is that you can blame all three orders at the same time and nothing ever happens. You're saying if you take it, if the municipalities take it,
And it's
then
ours.
we come to you and we vote the bums
Yes.
out if you don't do it. And that's what
So
you say.
we can articulate, here's what we need.
Okay.
National Housing Strategy's got two goals. One is to end homelessness, chronic homelessness, and one is to reduce core housing need by 50%. I can tell you exactly to the number, I can send it to you, to the number, what that would take in the City of Ottawa, and we're getting a fraction of it. So give us that money, and then if we don't produce, if we don't end chronic homelessness, and we could do it, it's not that much. Ottawa's not gone too far. If we can't reduce our core housing need, and we can do it with the right funding, and we all have to be part of it, but we should have the full accountability and responsibility. We're unique. We are very different than Vancouver. We are very different than Hamilton. We get different types of families come to us from different ways. People are homeless in different ways. We have a large homeless population in rooming houses in this city, and we have no way of addressing that because of provincial rules around rent supplements and funding. Give it to the municipalities. Let us tell you what we need, and then take that full responsibility.
You heard it here first on City Talk. Housing first, local first, from Councillor McKenney. I'm interested in terms of the next 6 or 8 weeks, when things start to get really intense in our communities. What kinds of steps, and remembering that, I think we're all agreeing there are many things that have to happen to address this. There's several, and there's probably 3 or 4 that are most critical, but then there's many, many, many. What would you encourage people that are listening today who are engaged in this? What would you encourage them to be doing and highlighting as we, over the next 8 weeks, 10 weeks, deal with people that will be sleeping rough in motels or in encampments? Thoughts on that? Betty, what do you think?
Build those relationships, get to know who they are, get to know what their needs are, get to know their name. So we can bring in what we need to bring in to be able to support them, but without listening to them and everyone else around making decisions for them, it's not going to land.
We've got to somehow be ahead of any kind of panic reaction that overreacts and becomes a very destructive, contentious thing. Okay, Donnie, what would you say?
I'd like to go back to something that Catherine said early on about the Parks and Rec folks being, if you will, second responders. And we found that through the pandemic, they were the frontline ambassadors. And whether it's a park ranger, at Betty, or someone from her team, the recreation folks, those are the folks that we need to empower, and we need to give training to on harm reduction. And they are the folks who are there talking to people every day. And those are the relationship builders, but we need to support them, and we need to get the Parks and Rec folks to actually see, and most of them do, this is part of the job. This is actually a critical part of the job.
So Donnie, I mean, we'd be happy to try to think about how we would make those conversations happen or encourage people within cities to do them, because librarians have had the same kind of challenge put in front of them, where somebody who took an MLS and thought they were going to learn the Dewey Decimal System and get the books right and help the kids read, and maybe they're going to do drag queen storytelling hour, they've got their head around that. But now they have to deal with people, they have to know how to administer a panic kit, they have to know how to deal with homeless, and they have for a number of years. And for the most part, library staff seem to have gone through this transition. I'm wondering if there's some value in us linking those conversations together, all the different ways in which civil servants or public servants and community agency folks need to train up on what Betty and you are describing, a kind of humane stewardship, care relationship with our urban neighbors. Yeah.
Mary, I love when you pick up what I'm putting down. You're exactly bang on. And you know what? Years ago, I started teaching nonviolent crisis intervention to librarians.
Aha.
And so we've been rolling out that training, but I think we need to go that step further, and it's the harm reduction. And that's where Betty's going to be coming in for us and really figuring out how do we best prepare our folks to go beyond that call and build the relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I know we have some, I know Eric from Halifax, who works for one of the BIAs and who's a navigator and is on the street working for a business improvement association doing this kind of care with vulnerable populations. I know Eric's in the chat somewhere. Thanks for him. I'm glad he joined, and there are others like him. The point, I guess, for me would be, and I'd love to throw this challenge out, could we not call it harm reduction anymore? I realize the public health community's spent decades getting that to be the accepted term, but it still puts a kind of stigma and a pejorative over there that we're trying to, in a paternal way, prevent someone from doing, you know what I mean? As opposed to something more accepting and inclusive and cognizant of, I don't know, that's just me.
I always took it as us not bringing more harm to the situation.
Right. You mean like us do no harm?
No,
Yeah,
that's
right.
Genuinely, that's what I thought it was, and that's how I see it. You know, we can't be doing any further harm, but if there's other language, I'm open to it.
Yeah, I don't know what it should be. Catherine, what do you think? If there was something, what are you going to be focusing on over the next 8 weeks? And what are you going to ask your council colleagues and your constituents to be focusing on?
You know what, for me, it really is compassion. You know, what we have is in our city parks, what we do have and where the conflict comes is mostly people who are in rooming houses, who are bunking, overhoused in rooming houses. They are essentially homeless, but they need those public parks during the day. It's that compassion. Just think about, you know, this is their living room. This is where they're able to sit. This is, and I often think about, you know, I sit on 5 BIAs, so I have a lot of experience with BIAs. And I can tell you, like, small local businesses are always the first to respond well when you have a solution.
Yeah,
as soon as you come up with a solution,
Yeah.
they respond well. They're part of that thread of our community. And I think about BIAs and small local businesses often as being on that front line because they're there every day. They're
you
seeing
know,
it.
I think this notion that you can be compassionate if you know that there's a process that's leading to a sustainable outcome. If you're just being told, oh, it's going to be like this forever, people's compassion wears a little thinner. But if we could have some commitment to some kind of plan, Leilani, that's your cue. I know you have a protocol. You want these municipalities to adopt a protocol. Is that
Sure.
doable?
I think, I
Labor Day?
mean, next 6 to 8 weeks, I think it definitely, like tomorrow, I think there should be a national prohibition on forced evictions of homeless encampments and people living in homeless encampments. Forced eviction is also a gross violation of human rights, and there's no slicing it any other way. And that's what all of these have been forced evictions. That's one. I think cities must, whether they like it or not, ensure access to adequate services like water, sanitation, a place to store personal belongings that's safe, as well as training for homeless encampments or the residents of homeless encampments, like security training, help them organize, help them understand the fire hazards that are real and genuine and how to mitigate those risks. Those are 2 big pieces. That would at least mean that people living in homeless encampments would be safe throughout the summer. They wouldn't be forcibly evicted, and it wouldn't trigger more trauma for them. And then they'd have the services and supplies that they need, doing what Betty said, all the while building relationships, figuring out who these folks are and figuring out how they are going to receive adequate, affordable housing very soon.
So on that note, I just want to challenge people that are policymakers working at the federal or the provincial or at the local level to hear what this gang is saying and what the chat is reinforcing, which is that we need some bold leadership and commitment on the part of government. And if that means to say, this is the action we're going to take down the line, and here over the next several months are the steps that need to be taken, and then mobilize and challenge municipal governments to do all they can, get all the lemon juice out of the lemon, to make sure that we're doing all that we possibly can so that people would understand we're on a path, a doable path to a different kind of future where encampments will look quite different, and where people will have more housing choices and more choices for the kind of supportive community and care that all of us agree that we all need. So thanks so much for joining us, Catherine. Lovely to see you, Donnie and Betty. Donnie, always great to see you. And we're checking in with you because I want to see what happens over at those parks this summer. Betty, good luck. Good luck for you. Really great to have you in the mix. And Leilani, always interesting for us to hear how the shift is advancing this and how we in Canadian cities are learning from cities around the country, around the world. So we're all in it together, folks. And it's a bunch of things that have to happen at once, top down, bottom up, from the side. We're all in it together. I want to thank Nick Hansen, who produces City Talk for CUI. Thanks, everybody. Next week,
Thanks to you, Mary.
Wednesday, because of the holiday, Wednesday, we're going to talk about the National Housing Strategy and what we heard doing a consultation for the National Housing Council, what they heard about the gaps in the National Housing Strategy. So I think all of you need to come back because that's a very important thing that will go directly to the minister about all the things we've been talking about. So great to see everybody.
Thanks so much, Mary. Great
Thanks, Mary.
conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Mary.
Nice
Thanks,
to see
everyone.
everyone. Go, Betty, go.
Thank you.
Go, Betty, go.